So first, let me extend my sincere appreciation and thanks to the AISSR and a number of individuals who've made my trip and time here possible. They include Eustace Uitermark, I'm going to destroy everybody's name, I'm just warning you, Nanke Verlo, Joachim de Vries, as well as a helpful and generous staff. I'm honored and thrilled to be here, not just because I'm a follower and an avid reader of the works of many of the faculty here at UVA, I'm seeing some Maria out there, but also because I cannot think of a better group to share some of my current thinking about the contemporary challenges of governance, urban and otherwise, in an era of climate crisis. The interdisciplinary character of the Institute and the commitment to emancipatory change embodied in the work of so many affiliated faculty and the departments are indeed inspirational to me. I wish we had a group like this at Harvard, which we don't yet. So thank you very much for this opportunity. So now on to the substance of my remarks, which come with a bit of a warning, or maybe a preamble, a qualifying preamble, and that is that what I'm going to share with you in this lecture, which I've audaciously titled Sovereignty in the Anthropocene, includes ideas still in formation. Much of what I will share here is built on contemporary problems that I am addressing in my current research on the governance of water and other ecological challenges, primarily in Mexico, a country I've studied for the last 30 years, but also in the United States. My remarks here also derive from conceptual work that I've been conducting with Frank Mueller, who is here tonight, I believe, focused on the project of rethinking sovereignty in the context of liberal and illicit urban and national economies. Frank was a Marie Curie fellow working with me at Harvard last year, and we continue our conversations, and I want to acknowledge Frank's contribution to my own reflections on this topic, although I am fully responsible for the substance of what I'm sharing today. Now, before beginning, my final caveat is that I am not here to give definitive answers, but rather to raise thorny questions and offer a series of intellectual provocations about the notion of sovereignty, how it could or should be challenged and transformed in the Anthropocene, and with what alternative forms of assemblages of governance that might be better suited for protecting our increasingly vulnerable existence on this planet. And I share my thoughts on these fundamental questions in the hopes that we can address them collectively as scholars, activists, and practitioners. Now, I'm well aware that sovereignty is a slippery and often reviled concept. I might have chosen to title this talk Political Formations in the Anthropocene, or even Changing Political Institutions and the Anthropocene, but I have elected to focus on sovereignty because my main interest is the climate crisis and the ways that contemporary ecological challenges might require a new form of governance. And what I find absolutely critical to the discussion of climate change is territory. Climate change requires us to take seriously what is happening to and in the territory, to the land, and what is above and below it. That is, to the material ecologies of everyday life worlds in which citizens, states, and even capitalists operate. It is thus the territorial dimension of sovereignty that inspires my use of the term to talk about politics and governance in the era of climate change. So as you see in this definition, anodyne definition, the operational word for me is territory, which not only focuses our attention on the geographies or the geographic scales of the political, but which also is an entry point for examining territory as having non-human, ecological, as well as human determinants, a point to which I will return later. To be sure, ever since the triumph of the Westphalian order, the national state has routinely been identified as the principal political institution through which the territories or the territoriality of formal sovereignty is embodied. and it's in most people's mind when you use the word sovereignty. In this regard, I want to use the concept and also critique it, because my mission is to rescale the notion in territorial terms and to, among other things, bring it down to the subnational level. In these aims, I often prefer to use the term imagined communities, drawing on the notion developed by the political scientist Benedict Anderson in his classical study of nationalism, and focus on the imagined and real connections that tie people together around a project of governance. Having said that, I would be remiss if I did not note that this definition is often interpreted as being about absolute or supreme power, which historically has been used for repression and domination of peoples by monarchs, colonial powers, autocratic rulers, and in the post-Westphalian world, nation-states in the service of their own authority. In the more recent neoliberal era, this has also been conceptualized as governance in the service of national and global capitalist development. And we know this argument about the oppressive logic of sovereign power from people like Agamben, who defines the sovereign as holding the right to make exceptions, and many scholars have argued that sovereignty can never be democratic. And that should give us pause. But there are also others who have underscored the concept of sovereignty in a less starkly historicist and Eurocentric way, and that see it as attached to liberation struggles or even equity. And that ranges from scholars like Marx, who uses the concept of popular sovereignty to discuss counter-hegemonic movements comprised of peoples, thus opening the door to critique the conflation of sovereignty with state sovereignty. So, and in particular, I want to underscore, I'm interested in governance, not government, not just state sovereignty, but sovereignty as a relationship of citizens to the state. So I'm also drawn, in addition to Marx's notion of popular sovereignty, to the notions of sovereignty embodied in indigenous communities and cultures and histories, which involve relationships of governance. And they also lay out the possibility that forms of popular self-governance building on an alternative imagined communities of allegiance can have meaning without accepting the Eurocentric notion or national experience of sovereignty, which informs most people's reading of the term. So I want us to be eclectic, pluralist in our understanding of what sovereignty could be. And even if the hegemony of the national state as the embodiment of sovereign power is true in the contemporary in discourses now, we should not forget that dominant forms and territorialities of sovereignty have changed over the last 100 years, which is hope for us to think about continued change. And I just referenced in this slide, I won't go over it, but the quintessential work of Charles Tilly, who was my colleague at the New School, in this amazing book on coercion, capital, and European states, talking about the ways in which the globe has moved from monarchical sovereignty to imperial state sovereignty, to a moment when imperial state sovereignty, national sovereignty, and city-state sovereignty coexisted. And the argument in this book is it's ultimately, the sad argument maybe in the book, is it's ultimately through war that the nation state wins. And there's a long argument, and we can talk about it later, but it has to do with coercing bodies and capital to work behind a sovereign project. But the point here is that sovereignty changes. It has changed in the past, and why shouldn't it change in the future? Now, for me, what is potentially instructive about non-Western understandings of sovereignty is not just the acceptance of what I will say is plural worlds at the same historical moment, unlike Tilly was talking about over time, in which indigenous sovereignty seeks to exist, that something is very well formulated in the work of the Zapatistas in Mexico, another group that I've studied extensively, who actually struggled to have their own sovereign power within the context of Mexican national state sovereignty, and struggled to mediate that relationship of plural worlds. So what is most powerful for me about the experience of indigenous sovereignties And let's not forget that in many settler colonial countries, indigenous peoples are termed First Nations people. So the idea of nation, the idea of kind of order, governance, is embodied even in what we might think as indigenous forms of self-governance and sovereignty. So, but also in indigenous communities, you see a common embrace of the ecological in the ontologies of being. The recognition of nature and the purposeful transcendence of the nature-non-nature divide in understanding the meaning and production of the life world must be absolutely central as we move forward to imagine new political formations and new sovereignties in the Anthropocene. Indigenous communities know this well, and the constant recognition of this is not merely a legacy of the past, but also meaningful in the present. This is Mayan production in Mexico using old techniques from hundreds of years ago for contemporary problems. Perhaps another way to think about a less hierarchical, more horizontal set of allegiances that integrate human and non-human dimensions of the life world is by discussing an ecological commons for the 21st century. Yet this also builds on the reality of many indigenous communities whose mode of governance can be understood through the lens of the commons, often built on arrangements of production of livelihoods that equitably distribute gains to the whole. But at least in a lot of the work I've done in the Mayan and other indigenous communities in the Americas, there are hierarchies and structures of power and decision-making authority, even within these indigenous communities that are structured around an ecological commons. So basically, I'm trying to answer the question that Antonio Negri has posted on the back of a very interesting book that I've been ravaging through called Climate Leviathan. I don't agree necessarily because they're really talking about sovereignty as existing on a transnational scale, but the question that Negri poses is the question that inspires me here today. Now, I am less interested, though, in these matters as abstract theoretical ponderings and more as urgent matters of contemporary political action. And more concretely, I've been pulled into the search for new political formations, or answering this question, new political formations to deal with climate change, by my involvement as a member of a research team examining a major ecological crisis unfolding in Apan, Hidalgo, which is a state in Mexico, a town in a state immediately surrounding Mexico City. As a matter of political context, Apan is a small settlement in a region in Mexico that shares the same topography and original wetland landscapes as Mexico City, which is about an hour and 15 minutes away by bus. It is a large agricultural and industrial region spotted with a network of settlements ranging from a few hundred to tens of thousands of inhabitants. The landscape is currently dominated by rain-fed barley production for multinational beer manufacturers. Just a few years ago, in 2018, AB InBev, everyone knows InBev, their subsidiary Grupo Modelo, which owns Corona beer, don't ever drink Corona beer, you'll find out why, which produces, Modelo produces Corona beer, opened a $2 billion plant in the region. This is a region that has been suffering extreme drought for the last 20 years, set in motion by climate change. And the impact has been most felt by smallholder ejido producers, and these are collective farmers whose right to collectively own and cultivate property is established in the 1917 Mexican Constitution as one of the products of revolution. And they have long cultivated their barley without federally recognized subsurface water rights, which industrial and urban uses have been granted in the past, but not ejidos, who are, in theory, have been revered parts of the national patrimony in Mexico. Now, in the context of the new facilities opening, they are even more at the mercy of radically changing rainfall patterns, further exacerbating precarious livelihoods. My task in that project, which in the interest of full disclosure was funded by the UK-Mexico Pact for Climate Change. So it was a transnational, two nations signing a sovereignty agreement, and I'll tell you later the fate of that project when López Obrador pushed back at the COP. But we had funding to start working in these communities in Apan to think about my part. UK Pact was interested in nature-based solutions, which everybody's interested in. It's kind of anodyne, important, but we were interested in new governance arrangements that might address the clear inequities in the water usage in this region. And as a sociologist and urban planner, I approach these questions not just as technical matters, but as embedded in ethical frameworks where equity and justice are as relevant as the specific interventions that might help the residents of Apan preemptively prepare for ongoing water crisis management. So this is just this is the industry and some shots of what this has done to kind of agricultural production in this region. Even so, what appealed to me about this particular project and context was our belief that the best territorial scale for enabling these or other responses to deal with this tension, this kind of crisis of sharing water, and I'll say a little, well, let me say a little bit more about that. The question of the scale to operate in was an open question, and I might have been somewhere else, so I'll skip it. But what's really important about this project is that the Corona Brewery cannot make money unless it has barley to process. Collective farmers need water to process barley. But the water that they need to process the barley to sell to Corona Brewery is disappearing. The aquifer is being depleted, not just because of climate change, but because the Corona Brewery is extracting water to process the barley. And there are several other industries in this area. There's a paper factory. You know how much water it takes to process paper. So this is a region of Mexico that had been like the site of industrial development in the 60s and 70s. But Corona is a new actor on the block. Coming in this, it's a wicked problem. How do they even survive, let alone the farmers themselves survive to produce the barley that they're producing? And I want to say that what they have imposed on farmers is monocrop production and impose the use of pesticides in order to produce, and they set the prices. So it's a very unjust relationship that's embedded in a problem of climate change. So in thinking about where do we start to talk about this problem, and again, we began in Apan, a very interesting region, or a town with a lot of mobilization there. The question of the territorial scale was really important. So the brewery is in the municipio of Apan, and the farmers there are attached to the municipio. And the municipality gives permission to extract water. I may say this later, I can pass over it. But the aquifer that they're using is shared by 5 municipalities. So again, this is why scale is a really interesting question. And again, water usage is in theory moderated or controlled by the national state, because in Mexico, everything under the ground is national patrimony, oil and water. Rivers, maybe state, but even the water ecology is complex and involves a variety of sovereignties and powers. So like a good urban planner, I considered, or our team considered, the usual option of menus for local community engagement and action. And we started by having meetings with the ejidatarios in Apan. But as we sought to move forward, we found ourselves thinking about how to move forward with potential opposition from national and transnational actors. So, and actually Corona Brewery itself never paid what they owed the municipality to be there. And instead they put their money in like social programs to kind of help with climate change, but they never actually stepped up to the plate with paying for the uses of water. But it became, and the nation, let me just say, then guess what the number one export item of Mexico is? Beer. So we have a leftist government in Mexico, López Obrador. But is he going to step in on this problem? I don't think so. And he has not yet. So, in thinking about an alternative arrangement for making decisions about this space that help that first relationship we started looking at, ejidatarios and the brewery, but understanding there are 5 municipalities that share this water, we started thinking about what would that alternative territoriality be. And we began to explore the possibility that a key element for new forms of kind of just getting people to come to the table and talk to each other about this problem, which hurts some farmers, especially the barley farmers, more directly than others, but the whole economy of the region is on the production of agricultural livelihoods. So it had a larger spillover effect. And we started thinking that we could build our conversations around the history and culture of the region. Not only the importance in the political history of Mexico of the ejido, but the strong ejido sentiments, but also thinking about the history of production. This area had historically been a production of agave, which is used for mezcal. So there are alternative ways to kind of this is again a nature-based solution, to rethink production, not just how people talk to each other, but what could be some other opportunities to kind of strengthen the voice of communities as they're fighting with the Corona Brewery. And agave doesn't require nearly the same amount of water that beer does. So, again, I want to show you the complexity of the ecology of the region in which this factory is embedded. Complicating matters, I'll get to that in a second, but water in the region also goes to Mexico City. I'll say some of that in a second. But what we have tried to do then in thinking about these 5 different regions is thinking about, we're building on history, we're building on culture, we're starting conversations. We had a team that met with ejidatarios talking. And by the way, in collective farmers, there are hierarchies of who, not only, usually men, not surprisingly, dominate ejido conversations, but they're also kind of fissures economically. But this is all an example of like more questions and answers. Some of the things that we were trying to work with them, the different types of, these are all in Spanish, I'm sorry, but Fernando, you can read that, do the translation later. But like different scales, spatial concepts that might have resonance to people that live there, but also different forms and modes of association. Mexico is a very self-organized country. But there are different ways. So these are things like an assembly, a work table, a negotiation table, a collective, a forum, a network, a body, a committee. I mean, even getting the conversation, this is a work in process, production. I know John's going to talk about that more. That this is some of the things that we're doing. So I'm taking too long. So, but in the context of like really starting in this local conversation, what happens is that there is another Leviathan hanging over upon not just the nation, and that's Mexico City, the capital city of Mexico, which historically has piped water from this region to Mexico City for water in the capital city, which is both a national and kind of an urban sovereignty objective. And I do want to say that there in Mexico, currently, and if you follow it, there are 2 women running for president. It'll be the first time ever a woman. And one is Claudia Sheinbaum, whom I happen to know, who is the mayor of Mexico City, very strong, progressive individual. But she just made an announcement about 4 weeks ago, and I've been working on this project for almost 3 years, that Mexico City needs to create new infrastructure to get water from Hidalgo to come back to Mexico City, So what's going to happen already? We have a dilemma of like the existing people here, because it's something like, well, whose sovereign life, whose bare life is more important? Is it Mexico City, the capital city, or is the people that live in this region? So it's a super complicated set of things. Now, the other thing I want to say that when we're thinking about that earlier slide, concepts to mobilize people, spatial forms of territoriality. The other important things is like what might be, we had lawyers involved with us, what might be the legal or juridical principles. And I want to underscore that already this InBev getting this factory there was a violation of the Constitution. And there's a Supreme Court case that's been going on and on and on because the permit to build that factory was originally given to a BMW factory by the state of Hidalgo. So permits for construction come from the state, but water access is determined at the municipality. And then they transferred it between BMW and the Corona Brewery without asking for permission. So it's in a way illegal. But still, the process, there's still a conversation in the context of this kind of illicit arrangement. And that complicates things. So, now as you can see from this particular project, far from setting as our target the entire system of federalism in Mexico and national water policies or regulations imposed by the state of Hidalgo, we turned our attention to the local level, seeking to establish some facts on the ground that could serve as a basis for a longer-term mobilization strategy of productive climate action. In the long haul, not just because of the resistance of the national state and also the location of Apan near the Mexico City, this has been a huge and not very successful project, which isn't to say that it's not an important project that we need to mobilize around. What I want to move on to a little bit more is like thinking about, well, okay, if we're looking for new territorialities, do we want to find one new one that could replace all those other territorialities? That seems kind of crazy, but it's not just enough to ask ourselves the question, what are the concepts of modes of organization and the territorial scale? I think that we also want to understand where would a new sovereignty arrangement fit in old sovereignty arrangements? And this is a quote that I have from a really great small article called Sovereignty in the Minor Key by Thomas Blom Hansen, who looks basically at colonial endeavors, the imposition of colonial sovereignty across South Asia and Africa and many parts of the world. And what he argues, of course, is that there exist examples of what he calls the minor key, built on customary traditions, social attachments, property arrangements, and other cultural and political conditions that sustained a diverse range of sovereign arrangements that could either coexist or compete with national state institutions imposed by colonial powers. As his point of departure in the colonial world, his objective is to challenge the claim that the history of modern state formation is one of systematic, centralized, and formalized expansion of the nation-state model along the line seen in Europe. Instead, he acknowledges that we have to decenter and globalize the ways that national states have historically wielded power, and he wants to show that different arrangements and forms of layered, shared, and partial sovereignty have always been a part, even of national state sovereignty under colonial and other forms of rule. So now, I'm not the first to recognize this fact or reality, that the multiple scales of sovereignty are being mobilized to address the climate crisis, bringing this to the present. We are seeing multiple scales, layered and partial, being mobilized. But I think, and I do think there are people in here, and I'm not going to be talking much about transnational agreements, COP and other things, and you'll see why. But given the and some of that has to do with the unequal distribution of climate efforts and the kind of fraught conversation between the global north and global south about at what point does a transnational sovereignty arrangement really help the issues of climate change if you look at it through a justice lens. But I wanted to question and thinking about the power and the kind of fragmented possibilities of national sovereignty from within the nation and not just transnationally. And that was the aim in the Apan project. So, and as a consequence, one of the territorial scales that we considered, which is kind of implied in my earlier slides, was the ecological region. And we wondered about whether that might form the basis for constructive, equitable, and just action. So, now I'm coming back and putting a little bit of my planning hat on to talk about regions and regional planning. And this is a quote from a really important work years ago, 40 plus years ago, about regional planning. And what the language of region means and could mean is, of course, contested, like everything in this lecture that I'm talking about. Some people might talk about city regions. Some people just might want to talk about dense urban settlements. I have done work, and maybe we'll talk about that later with John, on urban sovereignty, but I don't want to be confined by a strict territorial definition of the urban. On the other hand, I don't want it so abstract that it's just any form of extraction outside. So for me, the notion of region allows me to look at like hinterland, urban, rural, hinterland relationships. And that's kind of the angle that we've tried to pursue in this project. What I think is interesting about the Friedman and Weaver work is that they really are thinking about a concept of basic needs, which was really discussion in the multilateral world back in the 70s and 80s. But they conceptualize the kind of urban-based rural development as an idea of basic needs that sustained what later got turned as the agripolitan approach. That implicit in it, it's a relationship between dense urban settlements and kind of rural production on the outside. And this concept built on several principles of self-reliant territorial development. So we don't even have to go back that far to realize that planners were thinking about these things with great energy just about 40 years ago. And then what happened with globalization and urbanization, and all of a sudden, once Saskia Sassen started writing and everybody's like looking at the big cities, and I'm as guilty of that. I studied big cities, but like that we really have kind of lost some of those original ideas. We don't even have to go to indigeneity to think a little bit about what they're calling agricultural development, but the needs and the principles. And what they lay out as principles are diversification of the territorial economy, maximum physical development constrained by the need for conservation. This is in 1979. Expanding regional and interregional, that's in the domestic markets, and principles of self-finance. So really kind of a governance from below back then. And this was very popular, and not to tell people, I work on the Global South, people talked about it a lot, but basically very soon, regional development basically became an excuse for industrial economic growth. And so it was used to kind of, how do we identify, using rank size distribution or whatever, where plants go and how production is, losing the agripolitan element in the urban element. So I wanted to we were thinking more about that and whether it's relevant for historical reasons to come back to the idea of regional. So now you might say, well, okay, Diane, you've just said that the regional approach is nothing new. So, like, why are you linking that to the Anthropocene? I mean, and I think that's an open question. Regional planning has a long history, but as I hope is coming through in this lecture, that there are evidences and practices from the past. It can be hundreds of years ago, it can be 40 years ago, that maybe we need to kind of look at, rather than being stuck in the current phrases and techniques that we're using in planning, to go back to this kind of the historical past. But I think that for me, the regional becomes a starting point for sovereignty or political action, because it allows that connection across like urban and rural production, different forms of lifestyles. But I think it's also, once we start asking questions about region, if I'm proposing that we use regionalism as a basis for thinking about governance and sovereignty in the Anthropocene, there's yet another question. So are certain ecologies to be prioritized in the search for a regional governance mechanism? In other words, I'm actually, and I'll have it on another slide, I want us to rethink the Latourian binary of the human and non-human and think horizontally about the differences across the non-human, the different ecologies. And where should that factor in to our understanding, even if we were going to follow regionalism? Where would that factor in? So the question then is, which natural resources make most sense as the organizing principle for regional governance? If the geological or ecological dimensions of a territory are too harsh, for example, prone to floods or droughts or other natural disasters that make settlement or the production of livelihoods precarious, establishing workable governance arrangements will be fraught. So it's not just any old ecologically based regionalism. The challenge is to recognize or identify which natural, ecological, or non-human materialities are most likely to lay the foundation for national state sovereignty, for sovereignty at any scale and alternatives to it, and then to assess the implications for the future. This is an example. In the United States recently, we've had a lot of wildfires, mostly on the West Coast. In the state, this is a different ecological problem than flooding and water. They are obviously related. And you have, if you have drought, you're more vulnerable to wildfires, et cetera. This happens to be a slide of indigenous ways of dealing, cultivating, burning, pre-burning, et cetera. But I think the point here is that there are different ecologies that have different relationships to this. In particular, this problem is a very big problem in the west of the United States, not across the whole nation. So the question becomes, do we want to think about regional governance based on ecology, but could it fit for a whole nation? Again, these are the questions of what's the scale we want to talk about. Maybe we can get some agreement on this in California, but like, what does that do to to Boston, where I live? We were suffering from smoke from wildfires in Canada. So, but it's the open question, which one that we would look at. I also wanted to put in here an example because I have a master's student working in Bangladesh right now. So this is a different ecological dilemma, back to the water again. But this is an ecological dilemma. Bangladesh is about to disappear because of sea level rise, but Bangladesh itself is an arbitrary nation, dare I say arbitrary, the product of war and boundary drawing. So just like, I think it's important for us to remember as we're thinking about ecological regions that they have a presence possibly that's more durable, even if they're changing, or let's say more that people identify with in ways that national state boundaries are often just imposed by the last power that was able to kind of draw those lines. So again, the question is, if you don't buy that the national state should make decisions, how even within that context, or in this case, is transnational, because both Kolkata and Dhaka are very close, and their economies and their refugee flows, everything, water flows are intertwined. How do we think about those kinds of complex shifting relationships? So the reason that I wanted to talk a little bit more about the wildfires and different, like having us think, well, what would it mean to build a regional governance mechanism on water versus, let's say, a wildfire or something else? There are many other ecologies. There's wind, there's air, there's sun, which float like water above boundaries in ways that even wildflowers are more embedded. Even if smoke floats, wildfires need territory and property to develop. And that leads me to my next point, conversation that we're struggling with, that I also want to lay on the table for our discussion, which is the role or the question of property and who owns property and where does that fit in a discussion of ecological governance. One of the lessons that the U.S. wildfires brought home to residents in ways that the water crisis does not always is the importance of understanding private property in discussions about the climate crisis and how to govern it regionally or otherwise. Although, of course, you see I have 2 slides about the insurance industry dealing with water. So insurance is a private corporation, but also some of these ecologies raise questions about whether private property is even going to be possible in some ecologies of the world in the future. Now, we know that property rights have been central to modern state formation, and in that sense, the laws that establish its centrality were central to the political economy that sustained relationships of sovereignty. And to borrow Thomas Hansen again, Thomas Blum Hansen, the question of control of property and lawful domination were at the heart of some of the earliest reflections on sovereignty and colonial expansion, explaining why, despite colonial rulers frequently imposing Western legal frameworks for private property and for concessions and other rights, they were often in combination with coercion, but they often coexisted with other forms of property in these indigenous communities that were existing under the new formal property rights. So again, historically, there are examples of layers of access to property, maybe common and private property together, which in some ways is what we have in Apan. There's collective property among the farmers, and then there's private property in the brewery. And how do we manage and how do we create a governance arrangement that has all those people at the table? We have to think about property. And what is the future of property in the Anthropocene? And I think the ecological questions put it absolutely center. So I've got some quotes about the coexistence of private and non-private property. I've also talked a little bit about the ways in which, I would like to underscore the ways in which preserving land ecologies as public goods is also on the agenda. So is there kind of a third? We've got private property, common, communal property, but there may also be public property. Even national parks are like public property. And where does that form of property fit into climate change and even governance? Should those decisions be made? Almost always they're, at least in the case of national parks in the United States, they're made by other sovereign levels. But do we want to kind of have a mix of those different properties in a governance arrangements that's regional? That's definitely an open question. And I just want to say that the problem is when these questions about property ownership, private and otherwise, and resources like hydrological resources that don't match up with the political boundaries to make those decisions. Now I'm going to draw I've got a couple more slides. I'm going to three general points that I want to share with you from my reading a little more at these different kind of layers of different forms of property. They're kind of historical lessons from that analysis. And the first point is that property rights and the extent to which the land or territory that becomes the subject of regional governance is public or private, communal or individual, is an open question. I'm repeating myself. That's part of the question. That's a tough question. There has never been one model historically, grand theorists notwithstanding. And that in turn suggests that it may be folly to aspire to a single model of sovereignty in the future. The second takeaway for me is that partial, shared, and competing or conflicting sovereignty has always been the norm. And we need to be prepared to deal with this possibility in the future. And third is that some ecologies, including those involving water, are by their very nature an existential challenge to sovereign domination, precisely because the ecologies of water, like air, wind, and sun, know no political boundaries. And that's another thing that I want to underscore. In my work, I've been working on, mostly in Apan, Mexico. I'm doing some projects in the United States on water. These are two maps that tell you a little bit about the complexity. The one on the right is the border and the different aquifers and the different ways in which water is shared kind of in a horizontal way, even though all of these decisions about all of these, as I will say in a second, are determined by the states, and the state of California has a different, even though a lot of these, the state of California, the state of Arizona, and the state of Texas have different ways to talk about private property and water, even within the same nation. And they ultimately are talking about the Colorado River Basin, if you've been reading about that, which is being depleted, and they're trying to abrogate treaties made 40 years ago by California because they've come out dominant in this. But also, and the slide on the other side is the ecological mapping of the West. And there was actually an explorer, political thinker back in the 19th century that was arguing that we should build states around these ecologies. Not around states, but of course states are built around different things. So the point I wanted to make is that that not only does this water, maybe I have another one here, water flows across jurisdictions, but that's part of the governance dilemma. So the other reason that I want to kind of end here on looking at U.S.-Mexico relations is that I've also, not only have I found that some of this, there are different property arrangements, as you've heard, in Mexico about water, but they share water bodies with those states in the United States. And to me, that's a question. So if I were going to do a regional boundary or regional sovereignty, what would that look like? And could it work on the border in the same way that it worked in Apan, Hidalgo? I have no idea. But the point is, this is a real ecology. The other second point is this is an ecology that has a transnational treaty about how water gets shared that itself is the consequence of negotiation and struggle. And so I think that what I would like to end with is yet one other question and concept about the idea of fixed versus flexible sovereignties. Because what's interesting about the U.S.-Mexico border condition is that treaty has changed several times. Just as now in the United States they're trying to change a treaty from 60 years, and that goes through legal and political struggle. But that in a way, treaties that at one historical moment were formulated to arrange with a natural resource within existing sovereignties are abrogated and renegotiated. And I think that gives us some hope to think about the modalities of thinking about new governance arrangements. Should we be thinking a little bit more about the flexible rather than fixed? And in that sense, maybe I draw a little on Michael Piori and Charles Sable, flexible specialization, the ways in which industrial production moved from Fordism to flexible. Because that was the way, this is a story to help capitalist development. But the point is that in many sectors, everything is not about fixity. And we think about sovereignty as in fixed boundaries, but we're really talking about flexibility. In the case of water in Mexico, I just want to underscore, this is river basins. These river basins transcend, maybe there's a uber region here, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So this is a kind of a different mapping of what those ecologies are. So flexibilization of treaties. So what I'm getting to the end. What I have been settling on to date, and then I'm going to loop ourselves back to Apan a little bit in this. Let me see, what is my next slide? Oh, okay. This is the other thing about a really important map. I want to say, in addition to the fact that treaties have been changed over the last 100 years between U.S. and Mexico, and now we're seeing those changes in the western United States. This is a photo shot of the Rio Grande on the U.S.-Mexico border. The sovereignty, where Mexico's territory ends and where the U.S.'s begin, has always been determined by this river. And it wasn't even signed until 1964, which was a different moment. And now you see how the river itself is changing. So the river is changing. So even the territory that's supposed to be Mexican or U.S. is changing too. So this is another reason just a clear example of how, as ecologies change, sovereignty, processes, modes, and conditions change. So where I'm settling, last page. What we've in the Apan case is a process of what we call triangulated regionalism, resulting from bottom-up as well as top-down efforts across multiple actors and institutions. Regionalist impulses and pressures emanating from multiple directions, even though we started working on the table with ejidatarios. So these kind of pressures from above at the state, international level, and below the municipal or ejido level are not, in this case, leading to some obvious and neatly static image of a specific regional unit for intervention. Sorry, spoiler alert, sorry. But this is, again, why I'm here talking to you, that this is the dilemma. Doesn't mean it couldn't be. But what it is leading to, a fluctuating and more dynamic understanding of some common or loose idea of territory that could be on the receiving end of regional impulses, processes, interventions emanating from different actors. And we're working on a series of kind of legal arrangements like a fideicomiso that allows us to build on a nascent understanding of region and a shared imagined community around water in the Apan area. So in that sense, in Oppen, our challenge has been to work with the various and not always neatly overlapping ideas of regional territory, which itself are changing and again, as drought continues, it changes as we speak. And these changes and some of the conversation depends on who you're talking to and the motivations for pursuing a project of regionalism. Analytically, it required us to separate out the region as a unit from the idea of regionalism as a process of working through ecological challenges that are threatening to production, consumption, and life itself. So, my conclusion. Let me end with some words of hope inspired by some of the main theorists of the Frankfurt School. Theodor Adorno, in his debate with Marx and Engels, quote, talks about what is required is not an account of a perfect world we can hold in our minds like a dream that can be realized merely because we dream it, but instead an account of the possible futures we can come to identify as potential outcomes from present actions in which things can be and not necessarily will be. So what will we can't assume that the possible futures that we might want to struggle will inevitably materialize, but we can struggle for them, and that's the challenge. Not just to dream alternatively, but somewhere in between those two. So I've tried to follow this line of reasoning in my efforts to discuss sovereignty in the Anthropocene by deploying both an analytical and normative or action-oriented approach. That is, I've tried to shed light on what is happening in the world of climate governance and why, with a focus on how and why conditions today may or may not parallel those of the past. Yet at the same time, I have tried to do so with a commitment to thinking about what should be done, particularly in the case of Oppen, and by whom, through what action strategies, which is how I define the concept of sovereignty. Now, doing both the analytical and the normative is always easier said than done. What will be important for future research or future work on both aims is to understand that ecologies like sovereignties are always in process. And as such, we need to theorize, again, their impacts on existing sovereignty arrangements with a focus on the transformative and mutable character of ecological and non-human materials. The workings of nature and non-human may actually be more dynamic and fluid than the workings of states, whose legitimacy, authority, and power are based on fixed institutional requisites and legal arrangements established to achieve sovereignty at certain moments in time. And then we get the holdover of those 18th and 19th century institutions not prepared for the 21st century challenges. But we've also found out that sovereignty is mutable, too. State formation is a process, and sovereignty is mutable, and it can enable more potentially insurgent action if we define it not just as embedded in the power and the authoritative and coercive power of the nation state. Put in the form of a question, no matter what normative path one chooses to forge at the subnational scale, such as a new governance arrangement for sharing water in Oppen or across the US-Mexico border, and no matter how fixed or flexible, strategies that we might dream and struggle for are likely to conflict or compete as opposed to coexist with other forms of sovereignty, be they national and global. So this means that we have to be prepared to understand who would be opposed to the ideas that we might come up with as a group of intellectuals working with activists on the ground in Oppen. So it's not just, and again, this is the normative and the analytical we have been planning, it's not just what we want to see, and not just what is just and what is right, but who is going to stop it? who's going to want to stop it? And that has to be embedded in the strategy. So we need to steel ourselves for the political battles that any questioning of current forms of political and economic power will inevitably involve. And we need to be prepared to take on the task of reducing conflicts over new sovereignty arrangements, even as we try to give life to their potential to help us address the climate crisis that is here and will not go away and will get worse. This will be a long and arduous process, but we do have some impact on path dependency, I believe, and that is what motivates me to ask these big questions and at the same time search for smaller, more experimental, and perhaps even more implementable action strategies that help connect these abstract ideals to ongoing work on the ground. Thank you.
So where to start? You touched upon a whole range of issues and the way they hang together. And maybe that's where to start. Why I think they hang together, and I think we're close to each other there. It is because the very central notions that you have touched upon, territoriality, sovereignty, Anthropocene, I think are all related to modernity. So modernity is the era in which we thought to achieve human and societal progress by somehow using science and technology to impose the will of societies on nature, on our environment, on our territories. And thereby, whatever the territory we're able to achieve what we wanted to achieve on that very territory. That's what the nation state could do, and it could later delegate that to lower tiers of government. And precisely that has appeared no longer optimal under current circumstances. We've been using that way our natural capital to an extent that is not sustainable, that cannot sustain our welfare any longer. And that means that we need to go back to more place-based strategies for providing food, for providing energy, and all the other things that are basic to fulfilling human and societal needs. And that makes these actors closer to the place more important, gives them more agency, and that's what you call, it gives them opportunities for regaining sovereignty. I think that's basically where it starts, and that I find fascinating about the story. Yeah. So yes.
Yeah. No. Well, I'm glad you liked what I'm trying to do. I mean, maybe one thing that I've kind of that kind of is implicit in the talk is the way in which. Okay, so we can agree on that as a larger project, but like, how do you start? How do you move beyond the recognition that we may need new sovereignties? How do you actually move forward? And that, I would say, as is probably obvious in my approach, there's not one answer, and there's not one universal question. It might not even be water, although I tend to think that the problems of water are so universal. Of course, we're here in Amsterdam, but like everywhere, too much water, not enough water. I mean, I know a lot of the discussion about sustainability and climate change is on carbon emissions, which is very important, getting to energy and things like that. But I feel like what's closest to like food and livability and actually survivability are the water questions.
Okay.
So I guess I want to say that, but even if we say the water questions, how you would address water in Amsterdam, or how we talk about water in Boston. Mm-hmm. I'm involved in a project in New York after Sandy from Columbia University to kind of try to think about a regional way to deal with water. But every one of these locations has their own politics, their own history, their own culture, and their own ecology. So I guess what would you do with these ideas? Is there some kind of middle level set of principles in between the abstract question and then like the grounded effort?
Yeah. Maybe we go through a couple of examples. Let's start with one, which is actually in England, in East Anglia, Norfolk, which is a county. And these counties are interesting from a governance point of view because they used to be created in a region that was hanging together logically from an ecological point of view in many cases. And that's an important background here and also conceptually interesting. In Norfolk, at some stage, somebody made a big public talk and said, I did some calculations, and we in this region can supply our own food from the farming going on in a circle of around 10 miles around Norwich, if only we make a shift eating less animal protein and more plant protein. So if farmers would start to go for ecological farming and make that shift, then we would be able to regain our autonomy in food, yeah? Talking about sovereignty. That was a talk that was found very inspiring by many people in the region, including a young guy. And he then decided to go to the University of East Anglia and study development studies, because that would teach him economics and business economics and things about farming and agriculture and so on. And he said, let's start it. And he started it. And were farmers who already were inspired. He helped them. And he started to build a small firm to sell their stuff, because they were novel food products. And that boomed. And it boomed not only because the farmers were enthusiastic, but also increasingly many people in the population. That was a sense of pride. And that grew, and now history comes in, when they found out that already the Romans were doing that kind of agriculture, were in that same way feeding their own region. And that later in the 17th century, their region had been world famous for doing that. Yeah? So it appealed to regional identity, regional chauvinism, regional pride, and it was precisely that which gave it enormous drive. And right now, this system has, in about 10 or 12 years, has grown, and I think the market share is something like 30%.
That's interesting, because, I mean, I was going to ask you, already told me a little about whose idea was this? So how does it materialize from below?
Yeah.
I think that's very important, but I still, and this is more a reflection for myself, it's not just for you to have to answer, for all of us to think about. I guess I'm constantly straddling, again, it's the normative and the analytical, but like what some of these like one-off experimental projects can do versus other larger fundamental changes. So that's why I ended by talking about path dependency. How do we make sure that we're thinking about doing something that's possible now, but it has to be connected to a larger trajectory that will set us on the pathway for more transformative change? And let me just say that I had in my earlier slides that what we usually see where you get a big bang for your buck, sorry to use that language, in some of these sustainability efforts in the United States, and I'm sure it's different here in Europe. Universities are involved in this, and you have this person, and now they use their university setting, but it's often with a big corporate sponsor, somebody who's really interested in like something like the energy market. And they will come in and join, and then we have bigger pilot experiments, legislative treaties, things that get signed when you've got big corporate actors involved. But when you don't have them involved, often the responses are just the small one-off things for obvious reasons, right? But how do we negotiate between those two things? And could it be then the ecology we choose? And that's one reason that I'm so interested in thinking more about water than energy. And I'm involved in a project at Harvard and the Salata Institute on the just energy transition with two political scientists, a sociologist, a lawyer, and who worked in the Obama administration, and myself. And they're so obsessed on, I don't want to say it's important, on the grid and energy change, which is really important, but energy is the area where people are making a lot of money, right? So you see sustainable, and you might see a pilot project that gets bigger in that sector, but where do we see it about some of these everyday cultivation? Or even people who live in basements in New York City that get flooded out when the water comes in. Where do we get big attention paid to something like water, which isn't easily marketable there's not an easy corporate solution to that water?
Yeah. Yeah, that's indeed an interesting. In the Norfolk case about food, it were indeed the corporates were drawn in, but because their customers were so enthusiastic and really were driven by the sense of identity, and that helped tremendous lot to make just the supermarket sell what they produced. Yeah, so that's how it went there. In this country, in water management, I think the real problem is actually not so much corporate business, but it is that in this country wouldn't have existed without water management for the last 500 years or so. Yeah, and the idea has always been that water management just enables society to do what it wants to do. So if there's a plan for a dwelling area, for an industrial area, water management facilitate that. They no longer can't. They no longer can. So there's now a serious problem in water management that you cannot just let the water do anything society wishes to do, and society will need to adapt its plan to the water. So there's now a formal principle from national government be launched, first water and then start planning. Yeah, so first consider the water system. And that is something that the society as a whole finds very difficult. Individual citizens, communities, corporate businesses, society as a whole is simply used to the idea that it can impose its will on the water system. And precisely the fact that this is no longer possible is a huge problem for current water boards.
Well, maybe you could talk a little more about that. I mean, because I'm thinking, what are there lessons, and not that you know everything about Mexico yet, but are there lessons from what's worked and what's not worked with respect to water management here? I mean, because I think the question you actually, and I have to as a sociologist pick up on that you said society wants something. So like, what is society, and the Netherlands is a smaller nation than Mexico, so maybe the sub-regional doesn't need to be as powerful here as it is in other places, but can you say a little something more about taking into consideration the kind of fissures within even the national territory about water? What can we learn? What should we do in other parts of the world, or what should we try to avoid with respect to, again, not just problem solving, but like the most equitable and participatory, if I can use that phrase, ways in which people make this their own kind of governance agenda?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And with leadership, can we trade for lessons from Mexico for Europe? Because it is far from being solved here, actually, in spite of the fact that water boards, par excellence, are in most European countries a kind of governance that has been adapted to the ecosystem. Mm-hmm. They typically follow water flows and so on in terms of the definition of the territory. But in spite of that, it has hardly been solved. I think it's still an imminent problem. An interesting example of what might help is indeed start to think from the future about past and present. And that had happened, for instance, in North Germany a while ago, where initially there was a project that was involved in that tried to persuade farmers to do ecological farming simply because that would be better for water management. And these farmers did not think that was very sensible. And then we were lucky. There were 2 very dry summers following each other, 2020 and 2021. And that was a huge threat to agriculture. And then these farmers realized that this shouldn't happen too often. And they could be persuaded in understanding that this was a direct consequence of climate change, and therefore it was there to stay. And then they were more open to the idea of adapting their farming systems in a way that would facilitate water management, and indeed were willing to enter the project and even paid for joining it.
Interesting.
Yeah? So that was an example of one thing of making the future relevant for the past, and the present really appreciate past habits and present habits.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I have the chance to ask questions to somebody else, but I guess I wanted to ask you where you think the question of property comes into the picture. There are 2 questions. I'll let you ruminate. They're both tough questions. The first, what I wanted to ask is, I wanted to ask your thoughts about the notion of agripolitan, because I know you've written about urban. So, and I've also written a lot about urban sovereignty. I've been studying cities, et cetera. Because of the nature of the place that I'm working in up on Mexico, I do think a regional governance kind of imaginary is important, even in the project I'm working on in New York, because you can't deal with a problem in Manhattan unless you look at where the water's coming from in the entire New York region. So I'm fully behind regional thinking. But the notion of agripolitan that goes back to kind of planning history is very important in the Apan region, because it has both industry and agriculture and small towns, but not big towns, small towns. So in response to what you were talking about, the Dutch case, and I know there's some tension between what are decisions made in the city and what are decisions made by farmers. What do you think of the notion of agripolitan in a place like the Amsterdam, or the Dutch context? Would it be acceptable? How does that coexist with the existing sovereignty arrangements? You have a city, you have other, provinces in the nation. So is that a helpful concept? Even though I would say the way you described the Netherlands has all those elements, food and production. So is that an appropriate concept as a planner? And where does that hit against positively, negatively exist in jurisdictions, and then there's the property question. So you can be busy thinking, what do you think?
Let me give two answers to the question about Ecopolitan and Amsterdam. First on Amsterdam and then on Portugal. In a place that maybe more resembles even the Mexican context. In Amsterdam, there are indeed people who in the area of food are working for what they call urban farming, using farming around the city to feed the city, close nutrient cycles between the city and the region and so on. They are a strong crowd, they are an activist crowd, they're working hard, but nevertheless, they do not get much support. Not from the city government and not from the population. I do think that is closely related. Would there be more popular support for such an idea, that the municipal council might be much more enthusiastic and supportive. So now they basically lose the battle for using a particular polder to major corporations, because government simply does take these interests much more seriously than the interest from that crowd. So that is, for the Amsterdam region, precisely an example of how difficult indeed it might be. Yeah? Okay. In Portugal, the story is about a crowd of fishermen who had a difficulty because fish was frequently scarce. That also was, of course, not only their difficulty, it was also the difficulty of the fish. And at some stage, somebody realized that something needed to be done. And he took over a so-called producers organization. It was sleeping because many fishermen had left. Talking about sovereignty, this is a European construct. So producers' organizations can be there in the region and can have regulatory authorities given to it by the European Union over particular producers. And this person realized that the problem was that these fishermen were all the time trying to fish as much as possible. And when there was a lot of fish, they could sell it, but at a low price. When there was little fish, they would just get all the remaining fish out of the sea and have no income as well. So it was bad for them, it was bad for the fish. And what he did was simply two things. First, he changed the auction system, which lowered the auction by lowering the price, into a system in which he asked restaurants, retail firms and so on, what do you need next week? And then told the fishermen what to catch and how much. And they organized, they made arrangements amongst themselves. And they could get a fair price. And in the second place, he created a freezing and cooling installation, where even if there were too much fish, he could store it, could still keep the price of that week high, and when there would be a shortage, he could sell what was stored in the storage. And that changed the entire relationships between these fishermen and these big corporations that were selling the fish.
Interesting.
Yeah?
Not the property question.
The property question. Yeah, you can approach that question from sort of a constitutional or an ideological point of view, and then I think we both know how difficult it is. In a more practical sense, it may occur here in the Netherlands rather sooner than later, because the energy transition and the water management transition and so on all run into the fact that we need more subsoil infrastructure, and space is scarce. So have a scarcity of place. Labor is also increasingly scarce. So creating all of infrastructure also is a labor problem. So somehow we need to become smarter. And smarter means basically calling for local systems. And because if you have local stable systems, you need less interlocal infrastructure. That's the quick story. And it's more place-based, it also makes it smarter for the reason I already mentioned. But that means if these systems become, let's say, small regions in which dwelling areas, industries and so on collaborate to have a relatively stable energy system amongst themselves, that increases the likelihood that property will also be more shared or at least be more democratized. And that is indeed precisely what's happening right now in the country. So maybe there the shift might start for a shift in property, or at least in the relationship between property and who has a say.
I'm really happy to hear that answer. I want to say that another project that I'm involved in is I'm very excited to have been named co-director of a new project that comes out of Canada called CIFAR, Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. And it's the project has this modest title of Humanity's Urban Future. So, and we're looking at 6 cities around the world. One is Mexico City. So obviously, for me, climate change is going to be a central thing of like, how can we imagine what futures will be and should we be thinking about it? And it's got a great team of people involved in it. But what I wanted to say is that what is my agenda in that project, it's a new area for me, just like climate change is a new area, is really initiating a more robust academic scholarly conversation about the future of property. And I think we can think about real world examples. So it's again the balance between the analytical and the normative, and there are experiments. But maybe we really need to take the big questions.
Yes.
Again, what is the fate of private property? Not every place, but if you live in Florida, in the United States, and you own property, you're not going to have property. So, like, what is the role of legal and cultural understandings of property in the Anthropocene? I think that's an agenda, and maybe next year we'll come back and talk about that here at AISSR. But that wanted to be my final comment.